Thank you very much for joining. Today we're going to talk about bringing the new React Native architecture to the open source community. And first, let me share how excited I am to be here at a meetup, because I think the last meetup I've been to was in 2020. And well, so much has happened in between. But I really enjoy getting in touch with the community. And I hope that, well, today there will be topics to learn about, but there will also be the opportunity to get in touch and get to know what you're working on. And also, I'm from Meta. There are other 4 engineers from my team down there. So use us. This is a prime opportunity to share your concerns, share your problems, or just tell us how things are working so greatly, if they work greatly for you, or tell us how badly they are, if they're not working so well for you. Also, I already spoke about this talk at App.js earlier this year, but for this specific edition, I made some changes, and I will tell you about what we're working on and some of the latest updates on the recent releases of React Native. Mandatory slide about myself. My name is Nicola Corti. I'm an Android engineer, actually. I work in the React Native team. You can find me online as Corti Nico on Twitter and on GitHub. So, as you probably heard or understood by now, this talk is all going to be about the React Native new architecture. So if you were to search on YouTube React Native new architecture, you will actually find plenty of content. A lot of talks. I actually recommend you to take a look. The first one is from ReactConf 2018. And, well, as you can see from the dates, a lot of time has passed. We started working on the new architecture of React Native in 2018, but rolling out internally, it took us just so long. And last year, in 2021, my colleague Joshua gave a talk at React Native EU, where he explained how complicated it was for Meta to roll out the new architecture on essentially the Facebook app, which is the biggest product, which is React Native at Meta. So, well, the dates are crucial. And yeah, as I said, we started in 2018. This was supposed to be a 6-month project. Let's just change some of the internals. Well, it turns out that the Facebook app is using React Native on any possible edge case. Product developers have been squeezing every possible performance gain out of React Native, which made changing the course so hard. It's like changing the engine while the plane is flying. But then what's next? Well, we didn't want to develop the new architecture just for us, right? We are strongly committed to the open source ecosystem. That's why we looked at what we built so far. And we thought, okay, how do we make people that are outside of Meta being able to use this architecture? And that's where we start now. How do we bring this all new set of tools to the open source community? So if you still are not aware of what is the new architecture, I actually want to do one step back and tell you why we worked on the new architecture. So the new architecture is all about the bridge. Lorenzo will give a talk after me on, again, on the new architecture, and we will deep dive a bit more on the internals. But essentially, if you're familiar with React Native, you know that there is this concept of the bridge, which is imposing a lot of performance on your application. The new architecture is designed to get rid of this component. As we took a stance at rewriting the internals, we actually realized that there were a lot of discrepancies between Android and iOS. So we decided to re-implement the core using a shared technology, in this case being C++. So the renderer and a lot of the internals of React Native now are shared between the 2 platforms. This allows us to share performance-specific optimizations. Historically, we used to have some optimizations on views on Android, which were not ported over to iOS. This will not be the case anymore with the new architecture, because we're going to build everything already available for both platforms. We also wanted to bring type safety in the React Native formula. As you probably are familiar with React Native, you work with JavaScript, you work with platform code, and now you also work with C++. And we want to make sure that things can't get out of sync because types are not matching or so. And the new architecture also is the foundational stone of a lot of new capabilities that we will be releasing in the coming years. So now that I talked about the why, let me actually talk about the what. Because you might find the new architecture in documentation, in blog posts, in videos online, and there are a lot of terms around it. So let me bring a little bit of clarity. We rewrote some of the internals, and specifically, we rewrote our renderer. The new renderer is codenamed Fabric, so you might find referenced it in libraries and codes around. We also rewrote the native module system, and we called it the Turbo module. We created a component which allows us to bring the type safety that I was talking about before, which is called the Codegen. And then we have a new mechanism once everything is in place, which gets rid of the bridge, which is called the bridgeless mode. Again, I don't have the time to deep dive into everything here, but I want to give you like a glimpse of our vision on the new architecture by talking about the Codegen. So what we envision and what we're actually doing at Meta is that we are asking developers to write like an API of how their component and modules will behave. And we call this a spec file. And this is nothing more than a TypeScript or a flow file where you can define what your API will look like. In this case, we have a method, answer the ultimate question, and we register this module. This is a native module. And the core here to understand is this function. Like this function, what we can understand from this, we can understand that, well, there is something that will answer the ultimate question, will take in input a string, and will return a number. From this information, we are going to generate code, a lot of boilerplate code, which historically you will have to write for both Android and iOS. So on Android, the code will look like that. It's essentially an abstract class in Java, which is already prepared for you as the constructors and everything needed, and then as a method, which is an abstract method, which respects the signature of the method we saw before. So now it's up to you, the developer, to implement the business logic and answer the ultimate question here. On iOS, similarly, we are generating Objective-C code. And again, you will have a protocol which you will have to implement with the same method and types which are specific to the platform, like NS number and NS string. The new architecture also brings a lot of changes in our stack and required us to tweak some of our tools. And I briefly want to talk on those because you might have that haha moment, which happens when you upgrade versions of React Native, and you might not fully understand why things are changing. So let me explain them. One crucial point where we're spending quite some time, and personally is also one topic that I really like, is build tools. So how do we make your code reach a phone? And as you probably know, at Meta, we have our own build tool, which is called Buck. It is open source, but we can't expect all the React Native projects to have Buck installed. We want to provide build tools which are platform specific and not alien for the platform where you will build. So this means extending Gradle on Android, especially adding support for building C++ code. That's why you will start seeing CMake files around, which describes how the C++ code should be compiled. We are looking into, again, extending our Gradle tools. So we wrote the React Native Gradle plugin, which would be the primary entry point for the new architecture. And in the future is going to replace the old react.gradle file, which you have in your template. Similarly, on iOS, we did basically the same job, but with CocoaPods. The logic is now being moved inside a lot of Ruby scripts, and we are also polishing the API over there. We wrote a lot of tests. So we are generally paying a lot of attention here, also because, well, a lot of complaints that we receive related to React Native is, hey, I update and the build doesn't work. Like this stuff just doesn't build at all. So that's why we're that's our first line of defense. And we are investing strongly on this side. Let me talk a little bit about another change, which is our JavaScript engine, Hermes. So you probably know Hermes. It's our, again, in-house built engine. And in the documentation for the new architecture, you will find it as recommended. We do have a dedicated team, which is looking at GitHub issues and problems you have with the JavaScript engine. So we can offer support to you on this sense. From React Native 069, we actually shipped a change which changes how Hermes is distributed. We call this the bundled Hermes. What this means, it means that every version of React Native comes with an engine which has been built for that specific version. So we can ensure that that engine is compatible. There will be no runtime crashes due to API incompatibilities or so. And from 070, Hermes is also the default engine for React Native. So when you create a new project, Hermes will be enabled by default. If for some reason you can't use it, you will have to turn it off. And also, please tell us now why you can't use it. I also want to talk a bit on modern languages, which is a topic which is often asked. And again, being spread across different layers, we have modern programming languages on different layers. Again, on web, TypeScript. When we released the first iteration of the new architecture documentation, the number one comment, the most upvoted one we received is, I don't want to use Flow to write my spec file, which I totally understand. Like, we wrote the Codegen and we wrote those toolings with Meta first in mind. You know, we had our problems to solve and then we started open sourcing it. But then we took a closer look into how we can adopt those tools so that the ecosystem outside Meta can actually use them properly. That's why the Codegen now fully supports both Flow and TypeScript, and we are actively working in extending the support for TypeScript, like supporting more types and so on. On Android, the new programming language is Kotlin. And here we are lucky because thanks to Java and Kotlin interoperability on the JVM, you can fully use Kotlin in all of your apps and all of your native modules and components. We are also spent time updating our website. There is a community effort to migrate the whole website to be bilingual. So now if you go on the website, you will find snippets in both Java and Kotlin. And in the near future, you might expect the template to be fully updated to be in Kotlin, just because, again, Kotlin allows for smaller code, so it will be less code to maintain for you in platform space, which means less things can get broken at the end of the day when you update. On iOS, instead, well, the situation is a little bit more complicated. Like, I know people will love to use Swift to write their modules and components, but due to interoperability between Swift and C++, it's not so easy. We are looking into it. I don't have nothing to share at this stage, but please stay tuned. And if you're strongly convinced into using it, please let us know and tell us what's your use case. And now, I talk a lot about the changes we have, but I want to become a little bit concrete here and tell you about timeline, like when things are happening. So, early this year, we released React Native 68. This was the first version that we consider new architecture capable. So here you can easily turn on the new architecture using a flag in your template. Then we released React Native 69, which had bundled Hermes, as I said before, and also is the first version of React Native which supports React 18 and all the features that come with React 18, like concurrent React and all the new APIs. I will talk more about this also in the next slide. Then React Native 70 was released recently, I think last month, and that brings a lot of improvements and changes for the new architecture, which came directly from community feedback. Some of the things we built there were just because when we released 68, people told us, well, this is awesome, but it can't work without A, B, C, and D. That's why, again, we have Hermes as default. I talked about it. We added auto-linking support for new architecture on Android, which was missing. We added support for CMake. Historically, you will have to use like custom make file provided by Android, which was really hard to maintain. And also we unified the configuration of Codegen. Lorenzo will talk about this also afterwards. Those are crucial changes which make the whole new architecture story easier to approach. For 71, there are other changes. 71 is not out yet, but there are other changes which are going in this same direction. We are simplifying the template by removing a lot of unnecessary code, both on the platform layer, so on Java and Objective-C, and also on the C++ layer. One of the biggest concerns that we hear from people is that they don't want to see C++ code, which, again, I can totally understand. But, well, this engine is running with C++ under the hood, so to some extent there needs to be a little bit of C++, but we are streamlining that. And there is more to come. Again, those versions are not finalized yet. So, and 72 and beyond, like, I'm happy, again, I was super happy to see that 70 incorporated a lot of changes which were requested by the community. But, you know, for us, especially also for me working on framework, I keep on doing changes and going in a direction, but I always want to hear what people think about the things we are shipping, because we might just be going in a completely wrong direction. So again, use the opportunity to share with us what's going on. I mentioned React 18 and relationship with React Native. So here, let me clarify a little bit what is the relationship between React and React Native versions. So if you are on React Native 67 or 68, or potentially previous version, you are essentially on React 17. You can't go in your package.json and change the React version. Like, yeah, you can, but you will still be running React 17 because React Native rebundles React and ships that for you. So every version of React Native decides which version of React to use. The first version of React Native, which uses React 18, is React Native 69. And here there is a catch. I mentioned about a lot of new APIs and concurrent features, hooks like use transition, start transition, and so on. They work only with the new architecture of React Native. The new architecture of React Native has been designed with the concurrent features of React in mind. Those APIs will not work if you don't opt in to the new architecture. So this is crucial to understand. And also is quite of a strong argument to consider the new architecture, as otherwise you will still be on older versions of React. And now, let me spend a couple of minutes on docs and material, because I talked a lot about changes, I talked a lot about when they're coming and so, but effectively, if you want to try the new architecture today, what you need to do. And again, we are also investing quite a lot of time on docs because the new architecture actually was in main since, I think, React Native 64 or 65. So you could technically sort of reverse engineer how things are working. But, well, would have been extremely mean for us to ask you to do so. That's why we spend so much time in writing docs. And again, it's all about the docs. I remember listening to React Native show, this episode, where they mentioned, like, yeah, there are libraries already using those APIs, but how they do, and so on. So it's really crucial for us to have good documentation that you can use and benefit from it. So that's why we have an official guide. You will find on the website, on the guides section, called The New Architecture. And this guides you through what this change is all about, the pillars, why we did certain changes, and so on. There is also a new section which is called Migrating to the New Architecture. So how practically you can bring your app, which is on React Native 67 or before, to the new architecture. We also spent time writing architectural docs. So there is this section on top. Actually, this screenshot is a bit old because we changed it last week. Now there is a drop-down menu. But you will find an architecture section with design documents on how the internals work. Now we have documentation about Fabric, and this is more like deep dive like things that explains you how the internals work, like how the rendering cycle works, and so on. We worked on the new app template. As I mentioned, in 71, we are tweaking it, simplifying even further. But from 68, you can effectively create an app and run it with the new architecture. And how will you do that? With React Native init, your project, and on iOS, the entry point will be your pod install. Actually, what you will have to do to try the new architecture is call this new arc enabled one variable, and you will effectively configure a project that will work with the new architecture. So with React Native run iOS, everything will work. On Android, similarly, we do have a file called Gradle.properties with a property called new arc enabled, which is default to false, and you can change to true and run it with React Native run Android. This is, again, default to false, but at a certain point in future, it will default to true. We are working towards that. So it's crucial that you start looking into these kind of things. You can, let's say, keep on ignoring the new architecture. If you looked into it and it didn't work for you, please let us know, because the direction where we're going is having this as stable. Everything right now is still considered experimental because we are, again, collecting feedback, integrating it, and iterating on this. But don't ignore those kind of changes, because otherwise you will not be able to update anymore so far in the future. Once you run, you will see Metro telling you that everything is running with Fabric set to true and concurrent root set to true. So those are the properties that React Native is passing to React, and everything hopefully will work fine. Other initiatives that we have in place is the New Architecture Working Group. This is a discussion-only GitHub repo where you can join. It's divided in sections. There are specific sections for talking about libraries, talking about documentation, giving feedback, and so on. And it might look closed. Like if you go there now and try to write, you will not have permissions. That's why you need to apply through the form. You will find it in the README. We are doing a little bit of sort of spam prevention here. And then samples, like a lot of docs, but we actually have things that run and you can look into and try. We do have 2 sample repositories. The first one is the app sample, which contains several branches, one for every version of React Native. And there are some that are Android only, iOS only, but every branch has a step-by-step guide on how to enable the new architecture and do things. And everything is, again, commit by commit with guides and explanations on what to do. And similarly, we do have a library sample repo, which explains you how to create a library. Specifically here, the focus is also to create a like a native module and a native component, which are backward compatible. Like you want to create something that works both in the old architecture and the new one, as you want to offer your library to all the users of React Native. And yeah, like, what's the catch here? I think Lorenzo will talk more about it afterwards. But libraries, like you need your libraries to be migrated to, like, especially if you have a lot of them, those might be a blockers. So if you depend on a lot of libraries, reach out to the maintainers, ask them to migrate. Some libraries already migrated. Some also quite big libraries already migrated, like Reanimated, Flashlist. I've seen like they are like, working on Fabric support. So libraries are migrating. If you have a library and you're not, like you haven't looked into this yet, now is the time to do it. And with this, I really hope that in a year from now or in 6 months from now, when I search React Native New Architecture on Google, I will actually find your story. That's what I want to read about. Like, tell us if things worked for you, if it didn't work for you, if whatever, like share feedback, let us know. And again, tell us your migration story. Tell us your pain, what works, what didn't work. And I want to stress once more how critical it is now to do those sort of migration and changes, because now we do have dedicated resources to address your feedback. We might not have them in 1 year from now. Like, we're gonna move on and do other stuff, and there would not be people looking at your GitHub issue, at your discussion on working group, and so on. So use this opportunity to look into this, give feedback, and let us know. And with this, well, I want to thank you very much for listening, and I also want to recall that, well, a lot of our project, our open source contributions are more than welcome, and I will not be doing Q&A now, but I'm happy to hear your feedback afterwards. Thank you very much.